Curious George goes to the hospital. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man, with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. What could it be? George couldn't read. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and all sorts of colors. So George took one out. Looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth. And before you know, he had swallowed it. A while later, the man in the yellow hat came home. George, I see you've already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise. Well, let's get to work on it. The puzzle was finished almost. There was one piece missing. The man looked everywhere, but he couldn't find it. Well, that's strange. It's a brand new puzzle. Well, it can't be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George. The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache, and he did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called the doctor. The doctor said he'd be right over. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out a stethoscope and listened. I'm not sure what's wrong. Think we better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray. I'll call him and let him know you're coming. Don't worry, George, said the man with the yellow hat when they were driving to the hospital. You've been there before, remember, when you broke your leg? Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were? George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital stairs. A nurse took them down a long hallway and gave George something to drink. It's called barium, the nurse explained. It helps the doctors find out what's wrong with you. In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was putting on a heavy apron. And then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? Nope, he didn't. Get on that table, George. I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides. He pushed buttons and there was a funny noise. There. Now you may get up and we'll have the x-ray developed right away. Let's see. There's something that should not be there, said the doctor. Hey, look. It looks like that yellow piece from the puzzle that we were missing yesterday. They're going to have to put a tube down George's throat to get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call a nurse and have her take George to the admitting office. Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait there too. Look, Betsy, said the woman next to him. This is Curious George. Betsy looked up for a moment, but she didn't even smile. Betsy had never been to the hospital before. She was worried. Finally, it was George's turn. A nurse took him to the next room. Wow, how many rooms and nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and address, what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. It says your name, George. Everybody here will know who you are then. Then the nurse came back. My name's Carol. I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward. We'll put you to bed, and there'll be lots of children there to keep you company. Well, so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around. Others were in their beds with a doctor or a nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion, and Steve had his leg bandaged and was sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was in bed, kind of looking sad. George got the bed next to Betsy. George was glad when he was in his bed at last. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while, then said, "I have to leave, George. I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in." Then he left, and George just sat there and cried and cried. Next morning, just like he promised, the man was back. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his blood pressure, another was giving him a pill to make him sleepy, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. "It's not going to hurt. Well, maybe a little bit, but only for a second." She took his arm, and George let out a scream. "But the needle hasn't even touched you yet, George. There. Now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it?" Not really. By the time the attendant came with a stretcher to wheel him back, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. He could see a big table with bright lamps over it, and doctors and nurses all crowded around. They had caps on their head and masks over their faces. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to his house when it all started. He looked funny with his mask on, and pretty soon, George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he didn't know what had happened. He didn't know where he was. Then he saw Carol, the nurse. "It's all done, George. They got the piece out. In a day or two, you'll be running around again." The man had brought him a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy. His throat hurt, too. He wasn't even curious about the new book. He just closed his eyes, and the nurse said, "We'll let him sleep now." Well, the next morning, George felt a lot better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the man, of course, came too. Betsy was watching from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. "Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk," he said. "Boy, I can hardly wait." "I'll take you to the playroom now, George," Nurse Carol said the next morning. "And in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home." The playroom was full of children. A lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint. There was all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater, and that was just the thing for George because he had 4 hands, so he could handle the puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon, a clown, a bear, and a policeman. The children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy, for the first time, smiled a bit. There was a TV on in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious. If he climbed on that record player and turned the switch, would it go round and round like a merry-go-round? It did. George went faster and faster, and he lost his balance and soon was sailing through the air. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion. The children cheered, and Betsy smiled again. George was so funny. But then the playlady picked George up. "That's enough for now," she said. "You better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead. The mayor's coming to visit the hospital tomorrow. And later on, George, you get to go home." Well, when George woke up, Steve was out of his go-kart taking his first steps. George was curious. The go-kart was standing there empty. He looked at it, and then he climbed inside. Then he grabbed the wheels, and then, while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. Oh, George could make that go-kart go very fast. This was fun. Down the hall he went. By now, the nurse had noticed he was gone. She came running. "George, George, George," she shouted. But George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner down the ramp below, and there were men busy pushing lunch carts, and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around the hospital. George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Oh, no! Spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jam were all over the floor. People fell over each other, and George was thrown out of the go-kart, and look, he landed right in the mayor's arms. "What a mess! You broke all the dishes. You ruined the go-kart. What will the mayor think?" everybody said. Suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From up above came happy laughter. And there stood Betsy, laughing and laughing and laughing. The children joined in, and pretty soon even the mayor started laughing. Everybody was laughing, that is, except George. Betsy came running down the ramp and threw her arms around George and kissed him. "Don't be sad, George. The whole thing was so funny. I never laughed so much in my life. I'm glad you're in the hospital with me." Now the director of the hospital spoke. "I'm sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor, but I think the best thing we can do is just clean this mess up and be done with it. George, you made a terrible mess, but you also made our sad little Betsy happy, and that's more than any of us could do. And now I see the man with the yellow hat has come to take you home. So goodbye, George. Take good care of yourself." Well, the children crowded around him, around the windows, and waved goodbye when George and the man with the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. As the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running. "Hey, George, here's a little package with something, but don't open it before you're home." George was curious. Well, who wouldn't be? The moment he reached home, he ripped the paper off the box, and there was the piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. "Oh, how nice of the doctor to save it for us," said the man with the yellow hat. "And now we can finish that puzzle." And George and the man with the yellow hat lived. The end.